Imagine Shanghai at the dawn of the 19th century, a city bustling quietly along the muddy banks of the Huangpu River. The port was alive, but not yet the gleaming metropolis it would one day become. Wooden junks drifted lazily past one another, their sails catching the occasional gust of wind that swept down from the Yangtze. The air was a mixture of salt, mud, and the faint aroma of soy and tea from the marketplaces. You could wander through narrow alleyways, lined with low houses, each with their earthen floors and papered windows, listening to the creak of cartwheels on cobblestones. Most of the people lived in a state of constant negotiation with survival, farming, trading, and the quiet rhythms of family life. In the midst of these ordinary lives, a strange, bitter leaf would begin to weave itself into the fabric of the city. Opium. Opium's path to Shanghai was far from dramatic at first glance. It began as a slow trickle of curiosity and commerce, rather than a flood of addiction. The drug itself was cultivated primarily in southern China, notably in Fujian and Guangdong provinces. Farmers there had long known how to extract the thick, sticky latex from poppy pods and dry it into small, manageable cakes. It was a labor-intensive process, but it produced a substance that, in minute quantities, offered relaxation, relief from pain, and, for the growing merchant class, a fleeting taste of the exotic. Initially, opium was not the daily vice of crowded dens or the target of imperial edicts. It was a medical curiosity, a commodity often administered as a balm for stomach ailments, coughs, or insomnia. Chinese physicians wrote about its careful use, recommending specific dosages measured with precision. This medical origin, though seemingly mundane, laid the groundwork for the more profound societal entanglements that would follow. Imagine, if you can, the quiet streets where apothecaries would grind powders and wrap them in tiny packages, unaware that these modest beginnings would grow into something far larger. By the early 1800s, the city's trade networks had expanded, connecting Shanghai to both coastal regions and, increasingly, foreign merchants. The city was officially a minor port, but it had always been a hub for local trade, moving rice, silk, and tea along its waterways. It was precisely these trade routes that allowed opium to spread more widely. Traders would bring small quantities for personal use or medical sale, gradually learning that there was a subtle, almost imperceptible demand for its calming effects. Unlike other goods, opium did not decay quickly, and it could be transported in bulk without great spoilage, making it an attractive product for enterprising merchants. The appeal of opium in Shanghai grew quietly. Unlike the dramatic tales of conquest or war, the spread of opium was more about social curiosity and the rhythms of daily life. Wealthier households began to experiment with the substance, often in social gatherings or during long, humid evenings when the city seemed to pause. It was not yet a public spectacle. There were no dens, no elaborate smoking rituals, only the cautious, careful use of a strange and foreign plant. People would sit in their wooden chairs, pipes in hand, inhaling the smoke and noticing a peculiar heaviness settle in their limbs, a gentle slowing of thought. An important aspect of this early period was the role of intermediaries, the small traders who moved opium from southern farms to Shanghai's emerging markets. These men were not grand figures of history, but ordinary merchants who understood supply, demand, and risk. They transported the drug in small amounts, often hidden within shipments of silk or tea, and sold it to local apothecaries or directly to households with enough wealth to afford a taste. These traders would navigate the bureaucratic eddies of Qing regulations, paying bribes, or simply relying on the inattention of officials preoccupied with tax collection and maintaining order. The details of these transactions were mundane: contracts in small notebooks, coins exchanged, and the occasional scandal if a shipment was intercepted. Yet these small, repetitive actions cumulatively laid the foundation for the city's opium economy. The cultural and social texture of early Shanghai also contributed to the drug's acceptance. The city had a unique demographic composition. It was home to farmers migrating from the countryside, merchants seeking opportunity, craftsmen working in modest shops, and foreign traders gradually establishing enclaves along the waterfront. Social mobility was limited, and life could be harsh. In this environment, opium offered a subtle escape, a way to step outside the relentless cycle of labor and obligation. People did not initially crave addiction. They simply appreciated the sense of calm it offered. Families often discussed the leaf in hushed tones, sometimes debating whether its consumption was wise or frivolous. It was not until the 1820 seconds that a shift began to take place. Foreign merchants, particularly the British, started to recognize opium not merely as a medicinal curiosity, but as a commodity with the potential to reshape entire economies. They had been trading silver and tea, and they realized that opium could create a new avenue for profit, connecting Chinese markets with production centers in India. Shanghai's role as a port meant that it was ideally positioned to become a distribution hub, quietly accelerating the flow of opium into households and eventually into public spaces. Consider the quiet evolution of a single opium pipe in one small household: a wooden bowl, a brass stem, and a delicate leaf, all carefully prepared. One inhalation, a slow release of tension, a softening of thought. These private, almost invisible moments multiplied across the city. Each act was a small echo in a growing chorus that would later fill rooms, streets, and entire neighborhoods with smoke. This is the subtlety that makes the early history of opium in Shanghai so fascinating. The change was not loud or sudden. It was incremental, a layering of personal choices, economic transactions, and cultural acceptance. By the end of Section 1, we can see Shanghai on the edge of transformation. What began as a minor curiosity, tucked into the medicine cabinets of households, was quietly establishing itself as a presence in daily life. The city's waterways, streets, and marketplaces were gradually becoming conduits, not just of goods, but of a habit that would soon shape society in profound ways. And yet, for now, the city remained ordinary, a place of muted activity and small commerce, unaware that the quiet leaf would soon bring smoke and shadow into its heart. As the 1820 seconds unfolded, Shanghai was changing in ways that few of its residents immediately noticed. The city's modest streets, which had been defined by quiet commerce and family life, were slowly accommodating new patterns of behavior. The subtle taste of opium that had lingered in private parlors was now beginning to appear in public spaces, hinting at the social and economic transformations that were quietly underway. Opium's transition from domestic medicine to public indulgence did not happen overnight. It was a slow, almost imperceptible shift, one that reflected the city's evolving social fabric. Small gatherings of merchants and literati began experimenting with smoking as a social activity. These were not dens in the sense we might imagine them today. No thick haze of smoke choking the air, no rows of reclining figures lost in stupor, but rather carefully curated sessions where pipes were prepared with meticulous attention. The ritual itself was almost meditative. The opium was gently heated over a small lamp, the pipe cleaned and polished, and each participant inhaled slowly, observing the effect on body and mind. What's remarkable about this period is the meticulous care with which these early smokers approached the drug. They were not seeking oblivion, but subtle relaxation, a brief respite from the rigor of daily life. Merchants, especially, found opium smoking to be a contemplative activity. After long days, negotiating shipments of rice, silk, or tea, the gentle heaviness induced by the drug offered a rare sense of calm. It also became a means of reinforcing social bonds. Shared smoke became a quiet ritual in which trust, friendship, and business networks intertwined. The role of traders in this transformation cannot be overstated. Local merchants began to see the financial potential in supplying opium, not merely as a medicine but as a commodity that could attract clientele willing to pay for both substance and experience. This required a degree of organization. Small shops, often disguised as tea houses or apothecaries, started keeping modest stocks of opium, carefully labeling doses and maintaining ledgers to track tumanics, purchases. The numbers were small at first, but they were consistent, allowing merchants to anticipate demand and adjust supply accordingly. Opium was also becoming a subject of observation and regulation. The Qing authorities, aware of the drug's growing presence, began issuing edicts regarding its use. These regulations were neither strict nor comprehensive. They often reflected the difficulty of enforcing laws across a sprawling, chaotic port city. But they indicated that something significant was unfolding. Officials would occasionally conduct inspections, confiscating small quantities or issuing warnings to apothecaries, but the bureaucracy moved slowly. As a result, early Shanghai smokers operated in a grey area. Their actions were legal enough to avoid serious punishment, yet illicit enough to carry a subtle thrill. The social implications of opium use began to extend beyond the wealthy merchant class. Craftsmen, laborers, and even small-time traders gradually encountered the drug through networks of acquaintances. The effects, while not initially overwhelming, were noticeable. A slowing of thought, a softening of anxiety, a temporary suspension of worry. For many, these small moments of relief became valued reprieves from the constant pressures of survival in a city where long hours, cramped living conditions, and economic uncertainty dominated daily life. Women's interaction with opium during this period was limited but not absent. Elite households sometimes allowed women to participate in smoking sessions, particularly in private gatherings, where social norms permitted experimentation within controlled environments. Women were more often associated with the domestic use of opium as a medicine, but their occasional presence in these early social rituals hints at the more complex patterns of consumption that would later emerge. It is worth noting that historical records rarely highlight these experiences. They were quiet, private, and largely unremarkable at the time, but their existence underscores the gradual normalization of opium in daily life. The physical space of Shanghai itself began adapting to accommodate this emerging culture. Narrow alleyways and small rooms were fitted with ventilation. Furniture was arranged to facilitate group gatherings, and modest lamps or brazier fires became standard fixtures for warming opium. The architecture did not change dramatically, but small, practical adjustments reflected the new social behaviors. Merchants and residents alike became attuned to the rhythms of smoke, when to gather, how to prepare, and how to maintain discretion. The city, in a sense, was learning to host this quiet, pervasive habit without drawing undue attention. Economic forces accelerated this trend. British traders, having observed the growing domestic demand for opium, increased the flow of Indian opium into China. Shanghai, with its accessible port and commercial networks, became an ideal entry point. The product was carefully distributed through both formal and informal channels. Licensed merchants handled bulk shipments, while smaller intermediaries moved discrete quantities to private households and tea houses. The financial logic was clear. Opium offered a high-margin commodity that could be sold repeatedly with minimal spoilage. For merchants, the slow, incremental accumulation of profit was preferable to riskier ventures in rice or silk, which were subject to spoilage, price fluctuation, or logistical delays. Yet the human cost of these early transactions was already beginning to emerge. Even in small doses, opium had a subtle but profound effect on the body and mind. Users described a creeping sense of lethargy, a softening of ambition, and an occasional fog over thought. Some merchants noted that productivity declined after habitual use, while others marveled at the social ease it produced during business gatherings. Families observed changes in loved ones, often dismissing them as temporary or minor, yet the cumulative impact was slowly reshaping daily life. This period also marked the beginning of Shanghai's transformation into a city defined by contrasts. On one hand, life was ordinary. Markets, schools, and temples continued their routines. On the other, The subtle proliferation of opium signaled the emergence of a parallel social world, one of smoke-filled rooms, careful ritual, and quiet indulgence. The city was bifurcating in a way that would become more pronounced in the decades to follow, setting the stage for the larger, more organized opium dens that would dominate certain districts by mid-century. By the mid-1830s, opium was no longer merely a private indulgence. It had become a social lubricant, an economic driver, and a subtle instrument of cultural change. Its presence was unremarkable, yet pervasive, weaving itself into the rhythms of the city in ways that were almost invisible. You could walk past a modest tea house and hear the quiet hiss of a pipe, smell the faint sweet bitterness in the air, and witness the slow ritual that would eventually define Shanghai's smoky culture. By the 1840s, Shanghai had transformed in subtle but unmistakable ways. What had begun as a quiet, almost domestic indulgence, small pipes, private gatherings, measured doses, was now becoming a visible, organized feature of city life. The humble homes and tea houses that had facilitated private smoking sessions began to give way to something more structured. The opium den. These dens were neither glamorous nor particularly grand. They were practical, modest spaces, carefully designed to maximize the comfort of smokers, while remaining unobtrusive to the wider population. Walking through Shanghai's alleyways at the time, you would notice the signs of this emerging culture. Small wooden doors with faded paper lanterns, the smell of sweet smoke wafting through cracks in shutters, the soft murmur of conversation punctuated by the hiss of heated opium. These were the hallmarks of an opium den in its earliest form. The dens were often located in back streets or courtyards, away from the main thoroughfares, providing both discretion and a sense of sanctuary for those who entered. Inside, the layout was surprisingly uniform. Low wooden beds or reclining chairs lined the walls, small braziers were positioned to warm opium bowls, and attendants, usually young men, moved quietly among the patrons, offering assistance in preparing the drug or maintaining the delicate fires. The clientele had also diversified, no longer restricted to wealthy merchants or elite households. The dens now welcomed a broader cross-section of Shanghai society. Laborers with small earnings could spend a few copper coins for a single session, while middle-class merchants indulged in longer stays. Women remained a smaller presence, often restricted to private rooms or secluded corners, yet their occasional participation reflected the subtle shifts in social norms regarding opium. The dens were spaces where social hierarchies intersected. An artisan might share a room with a minor official, and the ritual of opium smoking created a temporary equality among those who entered. Economically, the dens became engines of small-scale profit. Proprietors carefully managed their stock, often purchasing bulk opium from traders and dividing it into precise doses for sale. Ledgers meticulously recorded transactions, and attendants ensured that each patron received the proper measure. These operational details were mundane, almost bureaucratic, but they were essential to the smooth running of the den. A mismeasured dose could provoke dissatisfaction, or worse, an overdose. The precision of supply mirrored the precision of consumption, creating a delicate equilibrium that defined the early opium economy in Shanghai. Socially, the dens began to exert influence beyond their walls. Gossip, business deals, and personal connections were all conducted within these smoky confines. You could overhear negotiations for small shipments of rice or silk, whispered exchanges of local news, or the quiet plotting of familial alliances. The dens were simultaneously spaces of leisure and subtle commerce, blurring the line between pleasure and productivity. This duality made them socially significant, even as they remained morally ambiguous in the eyes of authorities. The Qing government, aware of the growing popularity of opium, attempted to intervene. Edicts were issued against public smoking, and sporadic raids targeted dens thought to be operating outside legal boundaries. Yet enforcement was inconsistent. Shanghai's rapid growth, combined with the dense networks of merchants and patrons, made policing difficult. Bribes and informal arrangements often smoothed the path for den proprietors, creating a system in which the law was acknowledged but selectively applied. The effect was not only to tolerate opium use, but also to normalize it within the urban fabric. The city was becoming, almost imperceptibly, a landscape defined in part by smoke. The cultural dimensions of the dens were equally notable. Smoking opium was accompanied by ritualized behaviors, careful preparation, repeated inspection of pipes, and the measured inhalation of heated vapors. Patrons often lingered for hours, reclining, conversing, or simply observing the subtle shifts in consciousness. Music, poetry, and conversation filled the quieter moments, creating an atmosphere that was both meditative and social. The dens were less about addiction in the early stages than about participation in a cultural practice that offered a temporary escape from the relentless pace of urban life. Yet, beneath the surface, the early dens hinted at the long-term consequences of widespread opium consumption. Even in small doses, repeated use produced a creeping lethargy, diminished energy, and occasional health complications. Families noticed subtle changes in the habits and productivity of their members, while employers observed shifts in reliability and focus. These effects were gradual, often imperceptible, but they were cumulative, sowing the seeds for the profound social and economic disruptions that would follow in the later decades. By the 1852, Shanghai's identity as a center for opium consumption was firmly established. The dens had grown in number and sophistication, and the city itself had adapted to accommodate them. Streets were mapped by the hidden presence of smoke. Alleys became conduits of clandestine commerce, and the social landscape evolved around the quiet, pervasive influence of the drug. The transformation from household curiosity to structured social institution had taken roughly 3 decades, and yet it remained astonishingly subtle to casual observers. Looking back at this period, it is striking how incremental changes, small trades, cautious experimentation, modest, social gatherings cumulatively reshaped an entire city. The rise of the opium den was not the product of sudden upheaval or dramatic events, but of mundane decisions repeated over time. Merchants calculating profit margins, families weighing the minor pleasures of the leaf, officials issuing regulations that were rarely enforced. The city had entered a new rhythm, a rhythm measured in inhalations and hours of quiet smoke, and in the collective embrace of a habit that would come to define Shanghai's 19th century identity. Imagine yourself stepping down a narrow alleyway in mid-19th century Shanghai. The city around you is alive, with carts creaking over cobblestones, children running errands for merchants, and vendors calling out their wares. Yet, tucked behind a modest wooden door with a faded paper lantern swinging gently in the breeze, is a different world. Here, the air is warm, thick, and tinged, with a sweet, bitter aroma that seems to soften the edges of reality itself. You have entered an opium den. Opium dens were never the same from one to another, but there were patterns. Most were modestly sized, with ceilings low enough that the smell of burning opium collected and lingered in a faint haze. Walls were lined with wooden beds or low platforms draped in cushions, each bed a personal space where an individual could recline for hours. The lighting was dim, with small oil lamps or brazier flames casting flickering shadows. The effect was not oppressive, but intentionally subdued, creating an atmosphere conducive to contemplation, conversation, or simply doing nothing at all. The attendants, usually young men from nearby districts, moved quietly among patrons, offering help with heating opium in small metal bowls, preparing pipes, and tending the fires that kept the opium at the right temperature. Their work was meticulous. Overheat the opium, and it would burn harshly. Underheat it, and it would not vaporize properly. Timing and technique were essential, and the best attendants were valued for their skill. Their presence was mostly unobtrusive, a constant, silent rhythm in the background, ensuring that the rituals of smoking proceeded smoothly. Entering the den, you would see a cross-section of Shanghai society, each person engaged in a careful, deliberate act. Merchants with fine robes recline near the back, pipes in hand, conversing quietly with friends or colleagues. Laborers and craftsmen occupied the middle platforms, sometimes sharing beds in pairs or trios. Their conversation subdued, but lively in brief bursts. Occasionally, you might notice a woman seated in a corner, her presence discreet, participating in the ritual with care. The demographics were subtle and revealing. Opium was simultaneously a leisure activity, a social lubricant, and, increasingly, a marker of cultural sophistication. The preparation of opium was a ritual in itself, designed to maximize both effect and experience. The dark, sticky resin was placed in small, shallow bowls, then carefully heated over a flame until it vaporized. The pipe, a slender, often brass or wooden device, was cleaned and polished before each use. Patrons would inhale slowly, often holding the smoke in their lungs for a few seconds before exhaling. Each inhalation brought a creeping sense of calm, a heaviness that settled gradually in the limbs, a softening of mental tension. The experience was cumulative. A single session might last an hour or more, punctuated by conversation, silent reflection, or even brief naps. Daily life in the den was remarkably orderly. Despite the haze of smoke, the atmosphere was not chaotic. Attendants ensured that fires were maintained, pipes were cleaned, and disputes, if they arose, were quieted quickly. Patrons respected the social norms of the space, which were often unspoken but strictly enforced. Speak softly, respect others' space, and maintain the delicate balance between indulgence and decorum. These rules created a form of social cohesion, even in a place that might seem, to outsiders, indulgent or morally suspect. Economically, dens were microcosms of careful calculation. The proprietor managed supplies meticulously, purchasing bulk opium from traders, dividing it into doses, and pricing each inhalation to maintain a steady profit. Attendants recorded each patron's usage, noting debts or repeated visits. Some dens even maintained small libraries or music instruments to entertain patrons during long sessions. A subtle form of value-added service. Profit margins were modest but steady, supported by the regularity of patronage rather than extravagance. The social function of the den extended beyond mere relaxation. Business deals were quietly negotiated over shared smoke. News from other parts of the city, rumors from faraway provinces, and political chatter all found their way into conversations among patrons. The den was a hub of information as well as indulgence. Merchants and craftsmen discovered opportunities here. Family connections were reinforced, alliances were subtly formed, and social hierarchies could be observed, negotiated, or temporarily suspended. Health and daily routine were intimately connected with the rhythm of the den. Patrons often arrived after a long day of work, using opium as a transition from the labor-intensive outside world to the calm of private reflection. Some would sleep for extended periods on their beds, the dense smoke softening the edges of discomfort and exhaustion. Over time, however, the physical effects accumulated. Lethargy, reduced appetite, and subtle deterioration of vigor. In these early dens, the human cost was often less visible than the social rituals, but it was quietly pervasive. The physical design of the den reinforced these behaviors. Beds and platforms were arranged to encourage both personal space and communal observation. Braziers were placed centrally, or between beds, so smoke circulated evenly without suffocating any individual. Lighting was deliberately dimmed, creating an environment in which perception slowed, and the city outside became a distant echo. Patrons often lost track of time, existing in a space where minutes stretched lazily, and the pressure of the outside world faded. Despite the seeming quiet, opium dens were sites of negotiation, social, economic, and personal. Each session was a balance of indulgence and self-regulation. Patrons monitored their intake attendants maintained equilibrium in the room, and proprietors ensured profitability without provoking unrest. In a sense, the den was an ecosystem, a contained environment in which smoke, ritual, commerce, and human behavior intersected in delicate, persistent patterns. By observing a single day in a Shanghai opium den, one begins to appreciate the subtleties of its influence. It was not just the chemical effect of opium that mattered, but the social choreography surrounding it, the preparation of pipes, the movement of attendants, the quiet negotiations, and the collective observation of rules and norms. Each detail reinforced a culture of habitual indulgence that would, in the coming decades, shape the city in ways both subtle and profound. Yet even in this carefully orchestrated world, uncertainty lingered. Patrons might overindulge, arguments could flare, or inspections by local authorities could disrupt the delicate order. Behind the calm rituals lay the ever-present tension between pleasure and consequence, between indulgence and societal expectation. The den was a mirror of the city outside, structured yet unpredictable, orderly yet fragile, and in constant negotiation with the forces that shaped life in Shanghai. By the 1852, Shanghai's opium dens had evolved far beyond modest back-alley rooms. What had once been simple spaces for private indulgence now functioned as microcosms of social and economic organization. Stepping into a den at this time, you would find a carefully calibrated environment, structured to balance comfort, ritual, and subtle control over human behavior. The social hierarchies, routines, and expectations that governed these spaces reveal a fascinating, often overlooked aspect of 19th century urban life. At the top of this hierarchy was the proprietor, often a local merchant or entrepreneur, who understood both the market for opium and the social dynamics necessary to maintain order. The proprietor's role was multifaceted. On one hand, they were business operators, managing supply chains, negotiating with opium traders, and maintaining financial records. On the other, they were subtle social managers, mediating disputes among patrons, setting rules for behavior, and cultivating an atmosphere conducive to long-term patronage. A successful proprietor needed both administrative skill and an acute understanding of human psychology. Beneath the proprietor were the attendants, the silent orchestrators of the den's rhythm. Attendants were responsible for preparing opium, heating the resin to precise temperatures, cleaning pipes, and attending to patrons' needs throughout their sessions. Their expertise was critical. A misheated bowl could ruin the experience, while inattentive service could provoke frustration or even confrontation. Many attendants were young men from nearby districts, drawn by steady wages and the social exposure that den work offered. In some dens, the most skilled attendants gained recognition, not merely from their employers, but from the patrons themselves, building reputations that occasionally allowed them to rise socially or economically. Patrons themselves were part of a subtle, informal hierarchy. Wealthier merchants, minor officials, and literati often occupied prominent positions within the den, reclining near the back or center of the room, where comfort and privacy were maximized. Laborers, craftsmen, or younger visitors were directed to peripheral areas or smaller platforms, where they could participate without encroaching on established social authority. These arrangements reflected existing social structures in the city, while simultaneously offering a temporary suspension of strict societal norms. The shared ritual of opium smoking allowed for conversation and connection across class boundaries, even if hierarchies were quietly maintained. Ritual was central to the daily life of the den. Each session followed a predictable sequence that patrons and attendants had internalized through repetition. Opium preparation was meticulous. Resin was scraped carefully, measured in precise quantities, and heated over small lamps or braziers until it vaporized. Pipes were cleaned, polished, and sometimes decorated with carved mouthpieces or engraved bowls. Patrons would recline on cushions or low beds, inhaling the fragrant smoke slowly, often holding it briefly before exhaling. This was not mindless indulgence. It was a practiced, almost ceremonial act, performed with attention to technique and timing. Conversations in the den were equally ritualized. Patrons spoke softly, respecting the intimate atmosphere and the collective need for calm. Discussions ranged from business negotiations and local gossip to poetry, philosophy, or reflections on personal life. These spaces became informal centers of information, where merchants learned about opportunities in other districts, laborers exchanged news of wage disputes or ship arrivals, and literati debated current events. The den's smoke-filled environment created a unique culture of communication, one that blended leisure, information exchange, and subtle networking. Even the physical design of dens reflected a careful understanding of human behavior. Beds and platforms were arranged to allow personal space while facilitating observation of others. Braziers were strategically placed to ensure that smoke circulated evenly without overwhelming any individual. Lighting was deliberately dimmed, producing a soft, hypnotic environment that encouraged relaxation and introspection. In this carefully managed space, time seemed to stretch. A single visit could last hours, sometimes extending into the late evening, disconnected from the outside world. Economic considerations were inseparable from this social environment. Proprietors calculated profits with precision, monitoring the intake of each patron and adjusting prices or doses accordingly. Supply chains were carefully managed. Opium was purchased from Indian or southern Chinese traders, then divided into standardized doses for sale. Dens sometimes offered small additional services, such as tea, simple meals, or reading materials, to encourage longer stays and repeat visits. The dens functioned as self-contained economic units, with clear hierarchies and operating principles designed to maintain stability, profitability, and patron satisfaction. Yet, the dens were not purely functional or commercial. They were also deeply cultural. Smoking opium was as much about ritual and aesthetic experience as it was about chemical effect. Patrons often lingered in contemplation, observing the way smoke curled into the air, feeling the gentle heaviness in their limbs, and noting the subtle softening of thought. Music or quiet poetry readings might accompany longer sessions, adding an artistic dimension to what outsiders would perceive as mere indulgence. The den became a space in which human experience was slowed, where ordinary anxieties faded, and where time itself seemed more malleable. However, the dens also embodied tension. There was always a delicate balance between indulgence and consequence. Overuse could lead to visible physical decline, lethargy, or social problems. Disputes among patrons could flare if etiquette was not maintained. Authorities occasionally intervened with inspections or confiscations. Proprietors navigated this tension carefully, balancing profitability with order, indulgence with safety. Their ability to manage these pressures determined not only the den's success, but also its reputation within the wider community. Women's roles in the dens remained limited but meaningful. Some participated in private rooms or attended specific sessions designed for female patrons, often maintaining strict separation from male-dominated spaces. Their presence was carefully controlled by social norms, yet it highlights the gendered dimensions of opium culture in Shanghai. Female participation was rare, discreet, and subject to scrutiny, but it also demonstrates that the den was a space in which social boundaries, though persistent, were negotiable in subtle ways. The dens also left subtle traces on the surrounding community. Alleyways, courtyards, and adjacent streets adapted to accommodate their presence. Nearby, vendors sold complementary goods, tea, snacks, or small trinkets, capitalizing on the den's traffic. Families of patrons observed changes in behavior, productivity, or social interaction, while neighbors developed quiet routines to avoid or coexist with the smoke-laden atmosphere. The den's influence extended beyond its walls, shaping the rhythms, economy, and social fabric of the city in ways that were often imperceptible, but cumulative. By the end of Section 2, we can see that Shanghai's opium dens were far more than simple recreational spaces. They were complex social institutions, balancing economic precision, social hierarchy, and cultural ritual. They were simultaneously places of leisure, negotiation, and subtle influence, shaping not only the individuals who entered, but also the city itself. By the 1860s, the opium den had become more than a private refuge or a niche social space. It was a defining feature of Shanghai's urban landscape. The city itself had grown, both physically and economically, with the port bustling with trade, foreign settlements expanding along the waterfront, and local industries multiplying in crowded districts. Within this evolving metropolis, the opium dens emerged as microcosms of city life, reflecting its hierarchies, networks, and the delicate interplay of order and indulgence. The den's influence extended beyond their physical boundaries. Patrons, returning to work or family life after hours of smoke-filled repose, carried with them the subtle imprint of their experiences. Conversations initiated in dens often spilled into the streets, marketplaces, and workshops. Business arrangements were discussed or reinforced within the haze, while gossip, news, and rumors circulated among those who shared the space. In essence, the den functioned as an informal hub for social and economic exchange, quietly shaping the flow of information, alliances, and commerce across Shanghai. Within the dens, the social order remained carefully maintained, but it was nuanced. Wealth and status dictated seating, access, and the quality of service, yet the shared ritual of opium smoking allowed temporary negotiation of social boundaries. A low-ranking craftsman might find himself seated near a minor official, sharing a quiet conversation that would be impossible in a strictly formal setting. In this sense, the den offered a controlled environment where social mobility, at least in interaction, was momentarily possible, providing a subtle form of social experimentation within the rigid structures of 19th century Shanghai. Economic dynamics within the dens also evolved in complexity. Proprietors had refined systems for inventory, accounting, and patron management. Attendants became skilled artisans of smoke, their expertise contributing directly to the den's reputation and profitability. Supply chains extended from southern China and India, moving carefully regulated quantities of opium into Shanghai. Pricing strategies were sophisticated, balancing affordability to maintain steady patronage, with high margins to ensure profit. The dens operated like microeconomies, small, contained, and surprisingly resilient, yet deeply interwoven with the city's broader commercial networks. Health and human behavior remained central concerns. Frequent patrons experienced the slow, cumulative effects of opium, lethargy, diminished appetite, and mental clouding. Families, neighbors, and employers observed subtle changes in behavior, while some sought medical remedies or limited access to mitigate harm. Even so, the dens thrived because their appeal was not solely chemical. The combination of ritual, social interaction, and temporary escape from the pressures of daily life created a form of cultural addiction, distinct from the physiological dependence that would become more pronounced in later decades. Gender dynamics in the dens continued to evolve. Women's presence was limited and often socially regulated, yet their participation through private rooms, female-only sessions, or occasional integration into mixed gatherings demonstrated the nuanced ways that opium intersected with social norms. Women navigated these spaces with discretion, balancing curiosity and social expectation. Their inclusion, though subtle, indicates that the dens were not merely male domains, but culturally flexible institutions capable of adapting to the needs and restrictions of diverse patrons. Culturally, the dens became centers of ritual and aesthetic experience. Music, poetry, and quiet conversation accompanied smoking sessions, creating a contemplative environment where patrons could reflect, connect, or simply exist outside the pressures of the city. The smoke itself was both a physical and symbolic medium. It softened the harshness of the streets, blurred social distinctions, and facilitated a shared experience of calm and introspection. Over time, this ritualized environment helped define Shanghai's cultural identity, embedding opium into its social and artistic consciousness. The city responded in complex ways. Authorities issued occasional warnings or conducted raids, yet enforcement was inconsistent. The dens operated in a semi-legal space, tolerated because they were discreet, economically beneficial, or socially useful as controlled venues of leisure. Neighboring businesses adapted, selling complementary goods such as tea, snacks, or small luxuries. Families adjusted routines to accommodate or avoid the effects of patronage. In these interactions, the den's influence radiated outward, shaping the rhythms of urban life beyond its immediate walls. By the late 19th century, Shanghai's dens had firmly entrenched themselves as institutions that mirrored the broader city, hierarchical yet flexible, economic yet cultural, regulated yet subtly transgressive. They exemplified the interplay between human behavior, commerce, and social norms. The dens were not merely sites of indulgence. They were reflections of Shanghai's complexity, capturing in microcosm the city's struggles, adaptations, and resilience. The lasting lesson of these spaces is clear. Even in their seeming mundanity, opium dens shaped social interaction, economic networks, and cultural practices in ways that extended far beyond the smoke-filled rooms. They reveal how ordinary human behaviors, rituals of leisure, careful economic planning, subtle social negotiation can collectively transform a city, leaving marks that persist long after the individual participants have left. In the quiet alleys and smoky rooms of Shanghai's opium dens, you might imagine that the drama of addiction unfolds in isolation. A pipe, a bowl of opium, and a solitary patron. But behind these intimate moments, there existed a vast and intricate web of commerce, a network of traders and intermediaries whose actions determined how the city inhaled its daily escape. Understanding the merchants of opium requires stepping beyond the dens into the warehouses, docks, and bureaucratic offices where the real work of distribution, negotiation, and logistics occurred. Shanghai's geographical position made it ideal for trade. Situated at the mouth of the Huangpu River, the city provided access to the Yangtze Delta and the wider interior provinces. Small boats, junks, and barges navigated its waterways, transporting goods of all kinds: silk, rice, tea, and increasingly, opium. Merchants understood these channels intimately, timing shipments to avoid inspection, coordinating storage in discreet warehouses, and navigating the subtle regulations of the Qing bureaucracy. Their trade was legal in the technical sense only when disguised as medicinal opium or tied to licensed traders. But the reality was far more flexible. Smuggling, bribery, and informal agreements were standard operating procedures, part of a practical business code rather than outright criminality. At the center of these networks were the importers, often foreign or mixed background traders who acted as intermediaries between production centers, most notably India, and the burgeoning Chinese markets. British merchants, operating out of treaty ports and increasingly attuned to Shanghai's growing appetite, supplied vast quantities of opium. These traders coordinated complex logistics. Shipments would arrive by sea, often under the guise of tea or textiles, then be transferred to smaller vessels bound for Shanghai's riverside warehouses. Each transfer carried risk inspection by officials, spoilage, or theft, but the profits justified the careful orchestration. Local Chinese merchants played an equally crucial role, bridging the gap between foreign suppliers and domestic consumers. These men and women understood the nuances of Shanghai's neighborhoods, the preferences of individual dens, and the social codes surrounding consumption. They were responsible for dividing bulk shipments into smaller quantities, often crafting precise doses for sale to households or proprietors. This process required skill, discretion, and an intimate knowledge of opium itself, its quality, potency, and appropriate storage to prevent degradation. One cannot underestimate the scale of the operation. Each warehouse could hold hundreds of pounds of opium, carefully stored in jars or wrapped in paper to maintain freshness. Ledgers recorded every transaction, noting sources, destinations, and prices. Agents traveled between cities, sometimes over days or weeks, to negotiate shipments or collect payments. In this way, opium moved not merely as a substance, but as a carefully accounted commodity, subject to the same logistical rigor and risk management as any major trade in silk, rice, or tea. The social impact of these merchants was subtle but profound. By ensuring a steady supply of opium, they shaped patterns of consumption in Shanghai. Dens could rely on predictable deliveries. Households could access medicine or recreational doses with regularity. The rhythms of the city itself were influenced by these networks. Social gatherings, work schedules, and even domestic routines adapted to the availability of opium. In a sense, the merchants of addiction orchestrated not only commerce, but also the daily life of the city. Risk was a constant companion. Merchants navigated both legal and environmental hazards. The Qing authorities issued periodic crackdowns, confiscating shipments or inspecting warehouses. Bribery was common, a practical means of ensuring passage. Yet it was not foolproof. Occasional raids disrupted operations and served as reminders of the precariousness of trade. Natural hazards, storms, river currents, and shipwrecks added another layer of uncertainty. Merchants developed strategies to mitigate these risks, diversifying routes, maintaining hidden caches, and cultivating networks of trusted intermediaries who could act quickly in case of disruption. Beyond commerce, these merchants were also cultural intermediaries. They translated foreign production practices into local consumption patterns, educated dens and households on the preparation of opium, and sometimes even codified social norms around use. The spread of ritualized smoking, careful dosing, and the etiquette of the pipe was, in many ways, facilitated by these behind-the-scenes actors. They were invisible to the casual observer, yet without their careful management, the dens themselves could not have functioned so smoothly. The relationships among merchants were also structured by subtle hierarchies and networks of trust. Partnerships were often personal, maintained through repeated transactions and mutual reliance rather than formal contracts. Reputation was everything. A single betrayal selling inferior opium, failing to deliver on time, or leaking information to authorities could destroy a trader's credibility. In this high-stakes game, interpersonal skill, discretion, and patience were as important as capital or logistics. Shanghai's opium economy was thus not merely a story of dens and addiction, but a complex network of human effort, coordination, and ingenuity. Each inhalation of smoke was enabled by a chain of decisions, risks, and careful calculations that spanned continents, rivers, and neighborhoods. Merchants orchestrated these networks with precision, often invisible to the people who ultimately consumed the opium, yet profoundly shaping both commerce and society. By the 1850 seconds, this system was well established, creating both stability and tension. The city's appetite for opium grew steadily, dens multiplied, and networks of supply became more sophisticated. Yet each link in this chain, from British importers to local Chinese traders, from warehouse managers to den proprietors, was a potential point of vulnerability. Smuggling, theft, legal interference, or environmental hazards could disrupt the delicate balance at any moment, demonstrating how fragile yet resilient the network truly was. By the 1860 seconds, Shanghai's opium trade had grown from a modest local phenomenon into a vast, interconnected network of merchants, traders, and intermediaries. What had once been a relatively simple path, from southern Chinese farms or Indian plantations to private households, had transformed into a complex system that spanned continents, rivers, and neighborhoods. Understanding how this network functioned requires looking closely at the strategies, hierarchies, and daily operations of the people who orchestrated it. At the top of this system were foreign importers, particularly British merchants operating out of treaty ports. They controlled access to the bulk of Indian opium, coordinating long sea voyages and negotiating licenses, shipping papers, and payment with remarkable precision. Each shipment was a careful calculation. How much opium to buy, which vessels to use, which ports to avoid, and which local agents could ensure smooth delivery once the cargo reached Chinese waters. Timing was critical. Ships had to navigate the monsoon seasons, unpredictable storms, and river currents, all while avoiding official inspections or interference by local authorities. Any miscalculation could result in the loss of thousands of pounds of opium and, with it, enormous sums of money. Once the opium arrived in Chinese ports, the foreign traders relied heavily on local merchants to handle distribution. These Chinese intermediaries acted as the invisible bridge between supply and demand. Their knowledge of the city's neighborhoods, social networks, and consumption patterns was indispensable. They divided bulk shipments into smaller, precisely measured doses for sale to household buyers and opium dens alike. This required meticulous attention. Opium that was improperly stored could degrade, diminishing its potency and reducing profits. Merchants kept detailed ledgers, recording shipments, doses, and prices, tracking each transaction with near military precision. A critical feature of this network was trust and reputation. Business was conducted largely on personal relationships rather than formal contracts. A merchant's word was binding. Failure to deliver on promises could mean not only financial loss, but social ostracism. Partnerships were cultivated over years, maintained through repeated successful transactions. Communication was constant. Letters, messengers, and intermediaries ensured that every participant, from importers to den proprietors, was informed about arrivals, shortages, or changing market conditions. In this way, Shanghai's opium trade functioned as a tightly coordinated system, where human reliability and discretion were as important as capital. Yet risk was never far away. Merchants faced both external and internal threats. Qing authorities occasionally attempted to enforce anti-opium edicts, conducting inspections or seizing shipments. Natural hazards, storms, river flooding, and shipwrecks posed constant danger to supply chains. Theft was a real concern, whether by corrupt officials, opportunistic thieves, or rival merchants. To manage these risks, traders developed multiple strategies. Shipments were diversified across different vessels and routes. Hidden caches were established along rivers and in warehouses. Bribes were paid strategically, not merely as corruption, but as pragmatic insurance against disruption. The resilience of the network depended on vigilance, redundancy, and careful human management. The dens themselves played a role in maintaining the network. They were not passive consumers, but active participants in the supply chain. Proprietors coordinated closely with merchants, specifying quantities, quality, and timing of deliveries. Feedback from patrons, preferences, complaints, or shifts in taste was relayed back to the suppliers, shaping both production and distribution. In effect, the dens were nodes in a broader logistical and social system, ensuring that opium moved smoothly from ports and warehouses into the hands of those who consumed it. The social impact of these networks was subtle yet pervasive. The availability of opium shaped daily life in Shanghai. Workers and merchants structured their schedules around den visits. Families adapted routines around consumption patterns. Even street vendors responded, selling complementary goods, tea, snacks, or incense to customers frequenting opium dens. In a sense, the networks created not just commerce, but an urban culture where the rhythms of smoke, trade, and social interaction were intertwined. Merchants also had to navigate the moral and social dimensions of their work. While they profited immensely, they were keenly aware that their goods could harm patrons. Many exercised discretion in sales, choosing to prioritize reliability and consistency over pushing excessive consumption. Some merchants engaged in informal education, guiding patrons on proper dosing, preparation, and safe use. While this may seem contradictory, it highlights the nuanced approach they took. Profit was important, but maintaining a stable, dependable network was essential to long-term success. Gender and social hierarchies also shaped merchant operations. Dens frequented by women required separate supply arrangements or private sessions. Wealthier patrons demanded higher quality opium, while laborers or artisans purchased smaller, more affordable doses. Merchants had to understand these variations and adapt supply accordingly. Their ability to navigate these social subtleties often determined their reputation, ensuring repeat business and influence across the city. By the late 1860s, Shanghai's opium networks had become deeply institutionalized. They were highly organized, resilient, and interdependent, reflecting the skill and ingenuity of the merchants who managed them. These networks shaped not only the availability of opium, but also the social, cultural, and economic life of the city. Each puff of smoke in a den, each quiet exhalation of resin-laden air, depended on this intricate web of human effort, calculation, and trust. Yet, even in this systematized environment, uncertainty persisted. Shifts in legal enforcement, changing social attitudes, and increasing foreign involvement hinted at turbulence ahead. How long could these networks remain stable when political pressures, social resistance, and economic opportunity collided? This question loomed over the city, a subtle tension underlying every transaction and every inhalation. By the 1870s, Shanghai's opium trade had become a defining feature of the city's economic, social, and cultural landscape. What had begun decades earlier as modest private consumption now depended on an extensive network of merchants, importers, and intermediaries who orchestrated the movement of opium across continents and neighborhoods. The merchants themselves had become unseen architects of the city's rhythms, shaping behavior, commerce, and urban culture through the careful management of supply, distribution, and social influence. The sophistication of these networks was remarkable. Foreign importers maintained fleets of ships and negotiated access to Indian opium with meticulous attention to timing, contracts, and risk. Chinese intermediaries acted as distribution specialists, managing warehouses, dividing shipments into precise doses, and maintaining relationships with hundreds of dens and households. Attendants and proprietors functioned as the final link, ensuring that the opium reached patrons in an orderly and predictable fashion. Every level of the system relied on human skill, discretion, and trust. A single failure could ripple outward, disrupting commerce and social order alike. The economic impact was profound. Shanghai's dens became reliable engines of trade, supporting not only merchants but also ancillary industries, tea vendors, carpenters who made beds and platforms, candle makers supplying lamps, and even scribes who timed sestages maintained the meticulous ledgers that tracked consumption. The city itself adapted to the rhythms of opium. Districts became associated with dens and warehouses. Social gatherings revolved around availability, and information flows, rumors, business news, and personal networks were shaped by the movement of the drug. The merchants were not simply suppliers. They were orchestrators of urban life, mediating how the city lived, worked, and connected. Socially, the opium networks reinforced hierarchies while subtly facilitating temporary mobility. Wealthy merchants and minor officials continued to occupy the prime spots within dens, yet shared rituals allowed interaction with lower-ranked patrons. Gender, class, and status were mediated through consumption, shaping patterns of behavior that reflected both long-standing social norms and the unique culture of opium smoking. Merchants understood these dynamics, supplying dens in ways that respected social codes while maximizing profit and stability. Yet the system was not without tension. Increasingly, authorities began to challenge the trade. Qing officials issued stricter edicts, foreign powers occasionally sought to regulate imports, and social critics highlighted the moral and health consequences of opium use. Merchants navigated these pressures with caution, using bribery, clandestine routes, and discretion to protect their operations. The networks were resilient, but they were also fragile, dependent on trust, secrecy, and constant vigilance. One misstep, an intercepted shipment, a disgruntled patron, or a bureaucratic crackdown could disrupt the carefully balanced system. The dens themselves evolved alongside these networks, becoming cultural as well as economic institutions. Music, poetry, and ritualized smoking practices were cultivated and refined. Patrons relied on attendants not only for the technical preparation of opium, but also for guidance on etiquette and ritual, creating a shared culture that reinforced the merchant networks and legitimized their role. The dens were simultaneously spaces of leisure, negotiation, and social experimentation, reflecting the human desire for both comfort and connection within a highly organized urban economy. Health consequences and societal dependence became increasingly visible. Chronic consumption led to lethargy, illness, and social disruption, affecting families and workplaces. Merchants, aware of these risks, sometimes exercised discretion, supplying doses in ways that maintained patron loyalty without provoking catastrophe. Yet the scale of the trade inevitably contributed to the city's growing dependency, illustrating the complex interplay between commerce, human behavior, and urban development. By the 1880s, the networks that sustained Shanghai's opium economy had become integral to the city itself. Merchants had not only facilitated the flow of a drug, but had shaped the rhythms of life, social norms, and even cultural expression. The invisible hands of commerce defined the city's habits and routines, demonstrating the extraordinary impact of coordinated human effort on daily life. The trade was simultaneously profitable, socially embedded, and morally ambiguous, reflecting the intricate balance between economic ambition and societal consequence. As the story concludes, one is left to reflect on the quiet but profound influence of these merchants. Their networks were not merely commercial structures, they were mechanisms through which a city's culture, economy, and social fabric were shaped. Every inhalation of opium, every ritual in a smoky den, and every ledger carefully maintained reflected the cumulative impact of human coordination, ingenuity, and adaptation. By the early 19th century, Shanghai was transforming from a relatively quiet trading town into a port city of growing international significance. Its position at the mouth of the Huangpu River made it an ideal point of contact between the Chinese interior and foreign traders seeking access to the lucrative markets of the Yangtze Delta. Yet this transformation did not happen in isolation. It was shaped by foreign pressure, Qing, government policies, and the expanding networks of commerce, including the opium trade that had quietly embedded itself in the city. Shanghai's port, while geographically advantageous, had long been subject to restrictions. Foreign merchants were limited in where they could reside, how they could trade, and which goods they could buy or sell. Canton, Guangzhou, had historically served as the primary point of contact with European traders, and Shanghai's significance had been largely regional. Yet growing demand for Chinese products, combined with foreign political and military ambitions, began to shift this balance. Merchants, particularly the British, recognized the economic potential of Shanghai and increasingly sought ways to establish a foothold. The opium trade played a central role in this transformation. British merchants, who had already established networks supplying Indian opium to southern China, began to see Shanghai as a strategic hub. The city's relative distance from the highly regulated Canton system, combined with its growing commercial population and openness to foreign goods, made it ideal for the expansion of opium distribution. By the 1822nd and 1830s, the city was quietly becoming a gateway for the substance linking foreign suppliers to local dens, households, and urban consumers. Foreign influence was not limited to commerce. Missionaries, diplomats, and sailors all brought new ideas, technologies, and cultural practices to the city. Small enclaves of foreigners began to establish semi-permanent residences along the riverfront, constructing warehouses, offices, and modest homes. These enclaves were both insulated and intrusive. They adhered to their own social norms, while gradually interacting with the local population, introducing new products, practices, and, occasionally, tensions. Their presence was a visible marker of a shifting balance of power, signaling that Shanghai's future would be shaped not solely by local actors, but by global forces as well. The Qing government, aware of these foreign pressures, attempted to maintain control through regulation and occasional enforcement. Edicts were issued limiting foreign access to the interior, restricting trade, and monitoring opium imports. Yet these measures were inconsistently applied, hampered by bureaucratic inefficiency, corruption, and the sheer difficulty of policing a sprawling city with an increasingly international population. This gap between policy and enforcement created both opportunity and tension. Foreign traders could expand influence, while Qing officials sought to assert authority, often unsuccessfully. Shanghai's growing population amplified these dynamics. The city was attracting merchants, laborers, craftsmen, and opportunists from across the Yangtze Delta, all seeking work and economic opportunity. This demographic shift created both demand and vulnerability. The dense, rapidly expanding population provided a market for foreign goods, including opium, but also made the city difficult to control. Social order depended not only on local governance, but on informal networks of commerce, trust, and negotiation that foreign merchants quickly learned to exploit. Opium dens, already quietly integrated into Shanghai's urban culture, now intersected with the broader currents of international commerce. British traders ensured a steady supply of opium from India, while local Chinese merchants and dens facilitated distribution to households and leisure spaces. Each puff of smoke in a Shanghai den was therefore a product of both local initiative and global trade, linking the city to distant lands and international political pressures. The presence of foreign traders magnified the economic importance of opium, while subtly shifting the city's social and cultural dynamics. The early 19th century also saw the beginnings of diplomatic tension that would later erupt into the Opium Wars. Foreign powers, particularly Britain, were increasingly frustrated by Qing restrictions on trade, access to ports, and control over tariffs. Shanghai, strategically positioned and commercially active, became part of this larger struggle. Foreign merchants pushed the boundaries of legality, testing Qing enforcement while expanding networks that would eventually play a central role in military and political confrontations. Urban life reflected these tensions in subtle ways. Streets near the waterfront began to accommodate foreign warehouses and residences, while local markets adjusted to meet the needs of a mixed population of Chinese residents and expatriates. Social norms were challenged, as interaction with foreigners became both a practical necessity and a source of cultural anxiety. Families, merchants, and local authorities navigated this shifting landscape, balancing traditional customs with the pressures of global trade. Even as Shanghai adapted to the presence of foreigners, opium remained a quietly pervasive influence. Its distribution networks were now intertwined with international commerce, and its consumption was shaped by both local and foreign actors. The city had become a crossroads of influence, where global and domestic forces intersected in smoke-filled rooms, bustling markets, and along the crowded riverfront. By the late 1832s, the stage was set for conflict. Foreign influence had grown steadily. Economic interests, including the opium trade, had become entrenched, and Qing authority appeared increasingly fragile in the face of these pressures. The city itself, both physically and socially, reflected these tensions. a mixture of opportunity and control, commerce and regulation, local tradition and foreign ambition. By the late 1832s, Shanghai was no longer merely a regional trading center. It had become a city on the edge of profound transformation. Its riverside warehouses, crowded docks, and bustling markets reflected not only domestic commerce, but also the growing imprint of foreign interests. British traders, in particular, were expanding their operations, navigating the delicate balance between Qing regulations and the insatiable demand for Chinese goods in Europe. Tea, silk, porcelain, and most controversially, opium, flowed through the city, linking Shanghai to global networks of trade, finance, and diplomacy. The opium trade had reached a scale that could no longer be ignored. British importers maintained careful supply lines from India, while Chinese merchants handled distribution to households and dens. Shanghai's dens had become hubs not only for leisure, but for information exchange and social interaction, forming a web of influence that connected local society to global commerce. The Qing government, long uneasy with opium, faced an increasingly intractable problem. The substance's economic entanglement with foreign trade made it politically and practically difficult to suppress. Enforcement efforts were sporadic, and officials often struggled with limited authority, bribery, and bureaucratic inefficiency. Tensions escalated as both foreign and domestic actors tested the boundaries of authority. British traders increasingly pressed for unfettered access to Chinese ports, while Qing officials attempted to enforce traditional restrictions. Shanghai, with its strategic position and growing foreign population, became a front line in this contest. The city's waterfront reflected the contest for control, Chinese merchants navigating local markets, foreign traders expanding warehouses, and Qing officials attempting inspections, often with minimal success. Everyday life for the city's residents was influenced by these negotiations, whether through economic opportunity, social interaction with foreigners, or the indirect effects of opium availability. The social dynamics of Shanghai were shifting alongside commerce. Local families, merchants, and laborers adjusted to the presence of foreign enclaves and new forms of trade. Streets became spaces of negotiation and interaction, as Chinese and foreign actors exchanged goods, labor, and information. Opium dens, previously isolated spaces of domestic leisure, now found themselves embedded in a network that reflected the broader currents of diplomacy and commerce. Patrons consumed not merely for personal pleasure, but as participants in a city increasingly shaped by global forces. These shifts were accompanied by increasing awareness of the opium crisis. Reports from concerned officials, medical observers, and social critics highlighted both the moral and physical consequences of widespread consumption. Addiction, social disruption, and economic dependency were evident in households and workplaces alike. Yet, the foreign merchants supplying opium were largely insulated from these consequences, their focus on profit reinforced by the logistical efficiency of their trade networks. The tension between economic gain and social harm created a subtle undercurrent of conflict in the city, one that would play out on both personal and political levels. The Qing government, under mounting pressure, sought to assert authority in multiple ways. Edicts restricting foreign trade, inspections of warehouses, and occasional confiscations of opium shipments were attempted. Yet these measures often faltered in the face of local resistance, corruption, or the sheer logistical challenges of enforcement. Shanghai's size, economic complexity, and growing foreign presence made it increasingly difficult for authorities to maintain control, revealing the limits of traditional governance in an era of global commerce. As tensions rose, the city itself began to change. The waterfront saw the expansion of foreign concessions, spaces where British and other European merchants operated under their own legal codes. These enclaves were not only commercial hubs, but cultural markers, introducing new technologies, architectural styles, and social practices. Residents of Shanghai had to navigate multiple systems of law, custom, and expectation, balancing local authority with foreign influence in their daily lives. The city had become a complex patchwork of jurisdictions, reflecting the broader contest between Qing sovereignty and foreign economic power. The opium dens, meanwhile, adapted to this changing environment. Proprietors coordinated more closely with foreign suppliers, ensuring a steady stream of opium, despite rising scrutiny. The rituals, hierarchies, and social norms within the dens persisted, but they now operated within a landscape shaped by international pressure. Patrons, aware of both the legal and moral ambiguity of consumption, continued to participate, finding comfort, connection, and escape in spaces that reflected the subtle interweaving of local and global influence. By the early 1840s, these tensions had reached a critical point. The scale of opium importation, the influence of foreign merchants, and the limitations of Qing enforcement converged to create conditions ripe for confrontation. Shanghai, already a city defined by commerce, social complexity, and cultural negotiation, now stood at the threshold of the Opium Wars. The city's residents, merchants, laborers, officials, and patrons were caught in the middle, navigating the consequences of policies, profit motives, and addictive practices that spanned continents. By the mid-1840s, Shanghai had become a city at the center of an international storm. The First Opium War, 1839-1842, had erupted over conflicts between the Qing dynasty and British merchants, driven largely by disputes surrounding opium trade, sovereignty, and the enforcement of laws. Shanghai, though not initially a battlefield, indirect and direct consequences of these tensions. Its riverside warehouses, bustling docks, and opium dens were entangled in a larger struggle between commerce, governance, and foreign intervention. The Treaty of Nanking in 1842 formally ended the First Opium War, but its provisions dramatically altered Shanghai's trajectory. The city was designated as one of the treaty ports, opening it to foreign trade and residents under conditions largely dictated by European powers. Foreign merchants gained unprecedented privileges. They could operate warehouses and offices in designated concessions, exercise extraterritorial rights, and negotiate directly with their counterparts across the Yangtze Delta. For Shanghai's residents, this created both opportunity and disruption, as new social hierarchies and economic pressures emerged alongside traditional structures. The foreign concessions transformed the city physically and culturally. Streets along the waterfront were reconstructed, too, to accommodate European-style warehouses, offices, and homes. The architecture, brick, stone, and wrought iron, contrasted sharply with traditional Chinese structures, signaling both the presence and permanence of foreign influence. These spaces were not merely commercial, but social and legal enclaves, operating under foreign law and staffed by expatriates who maintained distinct social norms. Chinese residents learned to navigate this dual system, balancing compliance with opportunity while negotiating subtle forms of resistance or adaptation. The opium trade, now intertwined with foreign influence and extraterritorial protections, expanded further. British merchants were able to maintain and increase shipments with reduced interference from local authorities, and Shanghai's dens experienced a steady supply of opium. Local Chinese merchants, dens, and attendants continued their intricate networks, coordinating delivery, preparation, and social rituals. For patrons, the dens remained spaces of relative escape, ritual, and reflection, though now framed by the broader political and economic currents reshaping the city. Socially, Shanghai's population faced significant change. The influx of foreign merchants, sailors, and officials brought new customs, goods, and technologies. Families, craftsmen, and laborers found both opportunity and disruption in this environment. Wages rose in some trades, while traditional industries and social hierarchies were challenged. Opium, already a pervasive element of urban life, became a cultural symbol of both indulgence and foreign intrusion. Its use reflecting the tension between old habits and new influences. Urban governance and authority were also profoundly affected. Qing officials, constrained by treaty obligations and limited enforcement power, struggled to maintain order. Foreign authorities and consular representatives increasingly mediated disputes, protected trade interests, and regulated their own communities. This fragmentation of governance created ambiguity. Streets, warehouses, and markets operated under overlapping jurisdictions, and residents had to constantly interpret which laws applied and where. Shanghai became a city of layered authority, with opium, commerce, and foreign influence intersecting at nearly every level of urban life. The wars themselves were felt indirectly in the city. Supply chains for opium and other goods were occasionally disrupted. Warehouses faced inspection or confiscation, and rumors of conflict created anxiety among residents. Merchants adapted, diversifying routes, coordinating with foreign contacts, and negotiating with local officials to ensure continuity. These strategies reveal both the fragility and resilience of Shanghai's urban networks. Commerce, social order, and daily life depended on constant negotiation between actors with divergent interests. Culturally, the city absorbed these changes in subtle ways. Music, literature, and social gatherings reflected both traditional Chinese norms and the influence of foreign ideas. Dens remained spaces of ritual, contemplation, and leisure, but their patrons now participated in a world visibly shaped by international forces. The rituals of smoking, conversation, and etiquette within the dens reflected an urban life negotiating the pressures of commerce, addiction, and foreign influence simultaneously. By the late 1840s, Shanghai had irrevocably changed. The Opium Wars had opened the city to foreign trade and influence, integrated it into global networks, and reshaped both its urban fabric and social dynamics. The opium trade, once clandestine and localized, was now part of a broader political and economic ecosystem, linking Shanghai to global commerce, diplomacy, and conflict. Merchants, dens, families, and officials all adapted to this new reality, negotiating survival and opportunity in a city transformed by war, trade, and foreign intervention. By the 1850s, Shanghai had become a city divided not only by streets and neighborhoods, but by legal and cultural boundaries. The foreign concessions, British, American, and later French, introduced a new layer of authority and urban planning that reshaped daily life in subtle yet profound ways. These concessions were more than zones of trade and residence. They were microcosms of foreign culture, law, and social norms within the larger Chinese city. To understand Shanghai during this period, one must step beyond the dens, docks, and warehouses and consider the lived experience of its residents navigating multiple worlds. Physically, the concessions were distinct from traditional Chinese districts. Streets were laid out in grids, lined with brick or stone buildings that featured wrought iron railings, wide windows, and European architectural motifs. Shops sold imported goods, cloth, tea, hardware, and luxuries, while restaurants offered cuisine unfamiliar to local palates. Street lighting, sanitation systems, and even public signage reflected Western sensibilities. For the residents of Shanghai, these spaces were at once fascinating and disorienting. Familiar trades operated alongside foreign merchants, and traditional social norms intersected with alien legal codes and cultural expectations. The legal distinction of the concessions was particularly consequential. Within these zones, foreign residents and merchants were subject to their own laws, often enforced by consular courts. Chinese residents, depending on circumstance, might be tried under Qing law or under concession regulations, leading to complex and sometimes contradictory situations. The enforcement of these overlapping jurisdictions required careful negotiation. Local officials, foreign consuls, and neighborhood elders mediated disputes, created precedents, and maintained a fragile equilibrium. Ordinary residents had to navigate these rules daily, adjusting behavior, trade, and social interactions to avoid conflict, while seizing opportunities presented by foreign commerce. Economically, the concessions catalyzed both opportunity and tension. Merchants, Chinese and foreign alike, adapted to the influx of capital, labor, and goods. Streets buzzed with activity. Porters moved cargo, shopkeepers sold imported wares, and craftsmen produced goods for both local and expatriate clientele. Opium continued to circulate, now intertwined with foreign legal protections and networks. The dens persisted, but their operations reflected new realities. Foreign merchants supplied bulk quantities. Local proprietors coordinated deliveries within the changing urban landscape, and patrons navigated social and legal ambiguities when participating in leisure or consumption. Everyday life was marked by the juxtaposition of tradition and novelty. Chinese residents maintained long-standing social customs, family hierarchies, neighborhood associations, and ritual observances, while simultaneously engaging with foreign norms, practices, and expectations. Children learned both Confucian teachings and, sometimes, rudimentary English. Laborers took on jobs in docks, warehouses, and shops that were controlled or influenced by foreign interests. Even clothing and diet were subtly altered as imported fabrics, tools, and foodstuffs became integrated into daily life. This blending of cultures created a hybrid urban identity, at once rooted in Chinese tradition and shaped by foreign influence. Social hierarchies persisted, yet were complicated by these new dynamics. Wealth, profession, and access to foreign trade now intersected with traditional class structures. Chinese merchants with connections to foreign traders gained prestige and material advantage, while laborers found opportunities but also vulnerability in the shifting labor market. Patronage within opium dens reflected these hierarchies. Wealthy merchants and officials occupied prime spaces, while working-class consumers adapted to less comfortable areas. The dens remained centers of both social interaction and information exchange, linking the city's domestic population to broader networks of commerce and influence. Public spaces and infrastructure also reflected this transformation. Roads were widened, markets organized, and riverfronts developed to accommodate increasing trade. Public health and sanitation became concerns, albeit inconsistently addressed, as the population density increased and foreign residents introduced new standards and expectations. Neighborhoods adjacent to the concessions experienced both economic spillover and cultural friction. As residents adjusted to the influx of foreigners, new forms of commerce, and emerging social norms, cultural life adapted in response. The arts, music, and literature reflected a city negotiating its identity between tradition and foreign influence. Social gatherings in homes, tea houses, and dens became spaces where locals and, occasionally, foreigners interacted. Information news, rumors, market intelligence flowed along informal networks, facilitated by personal relationships and neighborhood associations. Even as the city changed, residents sought continuity in ritual, family life, and community practices, blending old and new to navigate daily existence. Education, both formal and informal, played a role in this hybrid environment. Missionary schools introduced Western subjects alongside traditional Confucian curricula, teaching children languages, mathematics, and trade skills that were increasingly relevant to Shanghai's evolving economy. Families engaged with these institutions selectively, balancing desire for opportunity with the maintenance of social and cultural identity. The result was a population gradually accustomed to operating within multiple cultural frameworks, preparing them for the increasingly cosmopolitan urban world of late 19th century Shanghai. Yet tensions simmered beneath the surface. The coexistence of multiple legal systems, foreign influence, and persistent social inequalities created subtle but persistent friction. Residents had to negotiate not only commerce and legality but also identity and belonging. Daily life involved constant, often invisible adjustments, determining when to defer to foreign authority, when to assert local custom, and how to navigate neighborhoods shaped by both opportunity and constraint. By the 1860 seconds, Shanghai's foreign concessions had become not only permanent features of the urban landscape, but also integral to its social and economic rhythms. The city was divided in law, culture, and commerce, yet its residents, both Chinese and foreign, were constantly negotiating these divisions. Streets, markets, and riverfronts were shared yet regulated spaces, and daily life depended on understanding the subtle rules that governed behavior, trade, and social interaction in this hybrid city. Economically, the concessions created opportunities that reshaped labor and commerce. Chinese merchants who established relationships with foreign traders gained access to capital, imported goods, and broader networks. These merchants acted as intermediaries, ensuring that foreign products from opium to tea, textiles, and hardware flowed into the city efficiently. Their success was contingent not only on business acumen, but also on understanding social etiquette within both Chinese and foreign communities. A single breach of protocol could compromise reputation, jeopardize contracts, or even invite legal consequences under foreign jurisdiction. Laborers, dock workers, and craftsmen found new avenues of employment, often tied to the burgeoning trade and construction within the concessions. Jobs on the waterfront, in warehouses, or in imported goods. Stores offered wages and exposure to foreign practices, yet these opportunities were precarious. Foreign employers sometimes imposed strict rules, demanded long hours, and paid unevenly. Laborers had to balance economic survival with adherence to cultural norms and social expectations in neighborhoods that were increasingly diverse and legally complex. The opium trade, intertwined with these economic and social dynamics, remained a quiet but influential presence. Dens operated within and near the concessions, relying on networks established by both Chinese intermediaries and foreign suppliers. Patrons from various social classes, merchants, laborers, minor officials, interacted within these spaces, adhering to rituals of consumption that reflected both social hierarchy and cultural adaptation. For many residents, the dens were places of respite, information exchange, and subtle negotiation of social boundaries, even as opium consumption continued to shape health, behavior, and local economies. Daily life in the concessions required constant awareness of legal and social boundaries. Streets were patrolled by foreign constables or local authorities, depending on jurisdiction. Contracts, debts, and disputes were mediated through a combination of Qing law, consular courts, and informal negotiation. Residents had to understand which authority applied in each context, often adjusting their behavior to align with expectations and minimize conflict. This created a form of everyday diplomacy, navigating multiple systems of power while maintaining social and economic stability. Cultural exchange was both subtle and pervasive. Western-style architecture, imported goods, and public infrastructure coexisted with traditional Chinese neighborhoods, temples, and markets. Families, merchants, and laborers selectively integrated foreign practices, learning English, adopting new technologies, or purchasing imported goods while maintaining Chinese customs in domestic life, ritual observances, and social networks. Children grew up with exposure to multiple worlds, developing skills that would later prove essential in navigating Shanghai's increasingly global economy. Social hierarchies became more complex under these conditions. Wealth and access to foreign networks conferred status, Yet traditional markers, family lineage, neighborhood reputation, and social connections remained relevant. Opium dens, while appearing as spaces of leisure, reflected and reinforced these hierarchies. Wealthier patrons occupied prime spaces, sometimes interacting with minor foreign officials or merchants, while working-class consumers adjusted to peripheral areas. These interactions were subtle forms of social negotiation, revealing how urban life in Shanghai was shaped by both opportunity and constraint. Public health and sanitation were increasingly pressing concerns. The dense population of the concessions, combined with widespread opium use and rapid urban expansion, created challenges. Foreign residents introduced new ideas about sanitation, street cleaning, and public infrastructure. But implementation was uneven. Local authorities and community leaders worked to maintain order, often negotiating with foreign officials to coordinate services. For ordinary residents, this meant living in a city where public health, safety, and regulation were inconsistent, yet slowly improving over time. Education and literacy became key tools for navigating this divided city. Missionary schools offered instruction in Western subjects, languages, and trade skills, while traditional academies continued to teach Confucian principles. Families often enrolled children in both systems, preparing them to function in a society increasingly shaped by foreign commerce, cultural exchange, and urban complexity. Education was both a survival strategy and a way to maintain cultural identity amidst rapid social change. By the mid-1860s, Shanghai had evolved into a city of contrasts and negotiation. Residents constantly adapted to a divided legal landscape, overlapping social hierarchies, and a cultural environment shaped by both tradition and foreign influence. The opium dens, commercial hubs, and residential streets were spaces where ordinary life unfolded against a backdrop of economic opportunity, moral ambiguity, and political transformation.